We're done with you. Don't ever try to find us again, Olivia said on Thanksgiving morning, her voice calm and precise as she adjusted the silver napkin ring beside her plate. Margaret Whitmore did not drop her fork. She did not gasp. She simply looked at her daughter-in-law across the long oak dining table that had hosted 37 Thanksgiving dinners in this house, and waited to see if her son would say something. Daniel kept his eyes on his mashed potatoes. The turkey sat untouched between them, steam still rising. The scent of rosemary and butter filling the room Margaret had decorated just hours earlier with linen runners and her late husband's crystal candlesticks. Outside, a thin layer of November frost clung to the lawn, turning the backyard silver in the pale morning light. Inside, the house felt colder than it ever had. Olivia folded her hands neatly. You should start packing today. Daniel and I have decided to sell the property. It's too large for you, and frankly, it makes more sense for us to move forward without complications. The word lingered in the air. Margaret noticed the way Olivia avoided saying her name. She also noticed the printed folder partially tucked under Olivia's designer handbag on the sideboard. Real estate listings, most likely. Margaret had spent the morning basting a 14-pound turkey, setting out the china she and her husband Thomas had received as a wedding gift in 1974, and polishing the same silverware she now watched her daughter-in-law grip with quiet impatience. She had lost Thomas 9 months ago to a sudden heart condition. Since then, the house had felt too quiet, the hallways too long. But it was still her home. Every inch of it. We're putting it on the market after the holidays, Olivia continued, her tone almost cheerful. It'll be easier if you relocate now. There are lovely senior communities about 20 miles from here. We've already looked. Daniel cleared his throat, but did not disagree. Margaret studied her son's face. The boy who once built snow forts in the backyard now looked like a stranger wearing her child's features. She set her fork down carefully on the edge of her plate. The clink against porcelain sounded louder than it should have. That's fine, she said evenly. Olivia blinked, clearly expecting resistance. Excuse me. Margaret reached for her water glass and took a small sip. If that's how you feel, I won't stand in your way. Daniel finally looked up, confusion flickering across his face. Olivia leaned back slightly, as though relieved the confrontation had ended so quickly. She mistook composure for surrender. What neither of them realized was that Margaret had spent the previous evening in Thomas's study, sorting through a locked drawer she had never opened before. She had found documents, trust agreements, deeds, and financial statements bearing her name in careful legal print. She had not reacted then, either. She had simply read every page, her heartbeat steady, her expression unreadable. Now, as Thanksgiving sunlight filtered through the dining room windows, Margaret glanced briefly toward the hallway that led to the study. She nodded once, almost to herself. They believed they were closing a chapter. They had no idea they had just opened the wrong one. Margaret remained seated for a moment after Olivia gathered the plates and carried them into the kitchen with brisk efficiency, as if the discussion had been nothing more than a minor scheduling detail. Daniel followed his wife without looking back, his footsteps hesitant on the hardwood floor that he used to polish every Sunday as a teenager under his father's quiet supervision. The house absorbed their movement and returned to silence. Margaret reached for her napkin and folded it slowly, smoothing the linen with the palm of her hand. The turkey cooled on the table, untouched. She stood, lifted the serving platter with steady hands, and carried it into the kitchen where Olivia was already running water over the fine china without asking permission. Margaret did not object. She simply turned off the stove and wiped the counter clean, the scent of roasted herbs fading into something neutral. Daniel spoke in a low voice near the refrigerator. Mom took it better than I expected. Olivia responded, just as softly. That is because she knows it is time. It is practical. The market is strong. We can list it for over 800,000. Maybe more. Margaret heard every word. She dried her hands on a dish towel and walked past them toward the hallway that led to Thomas's study. The door had remained closed for months, preserved like a memory. She opened it now and stepped inside. The room still carried the faint scent of cedar and old paper. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting thin stripes. Across the mahogany desk, she sat down in Thomas's leather chair and opened the drawer she had unlocked the previous night. Inside lay a thick folder labeled in his careful handwriting, estate planning. She lifted the documents again, reading each page slowly, not because she did not understand, but because she wanted to understand completely. The house deed bore her name as sole owner. The family trust, established 5 years earlier, designated her as primary beneficiary and trustee. Any sale of property required her written consent and a review by the family attorney. There were additional clauses she had not noticed before, protections against coercion, stipulations regarding financial control, and a provision allowing immediate suspension of discretionary payments if any beneficiary attempted to undermine the trustee's authority. Margaret rested her fingers lightly on the edge of the paper. The mortgage that Daniel and Olivia believed they were paying had in fact been covered by distributions from the trust. The car registered in Daniel's name was financed through the same structure. Thomas had arranged everything with quiet precision. He had never spoken dramatically about protection or fear. He had simply prepared. Margaret leaned back and allowed herself one slow breath. She was not angry. Anger would have been loud. What she felt instead was clarity. In the kitchen, Olivia laughed at something on her phone. Daniel's voice joined hers, lighter now, relieved. They believed the decision had been made. Margaret gathered the documents into a neat stack and placed them inside a slim leather portfolio. She then opened the small notebook she had brought with her and began writing down dates, conversations, and details she remembered from the past few months. The realtor's business card she had found in the trash. The email notification that had appeared briefly on Daniel's laptop when he left it open on the dining table. The casual suggestion that she should consider assisted living, repeated 3 times in 2 weeks. She did not rush. Outside, a delivery truck drove past at exactly 25 miles per hour, as it always did on holidays in their quiet suburban neighborhood. The ordinary rhythm of the day continued. Margaret closed the notebook and stood, smoothing her sweater. She walked back into the living room where the autumn decorations still hung above the fireplace. Olivia glanced up. "We should start sorting through your things this weekend," she said brightly. Margaret met her eyes and offered a small, measured smile. "There will be time," she replied. And for the first time since Thomas had passed, she understood exactly how much time was truly hers. The following morning the house moved through its usual rhythm, but Margaret noticed how different it felt when she listened carefully. Daniel left early for work, his travel mug in hand, offering a distracted goodbye that lingered somewhere between habit and avoidance. Olivia stayed behind, moving from room to room with her phone pressed to her ear, her tone bright and efficient. Margaret sat at the breakfast table with a cup of black coffee, watching the steam rise in thin spirals. She had slept well, better than she had in months, and that alone unsettled her. Grief had kept her awake for so long that rest now felt unfamiliar. From the hallway she heard Olivia say, "Yes, we want to move quickly. The sooner we list, the better. She is cooperative." Margaret set her cup down without a sound. Cooperative. It was an interesting word. She finished her coffee, rinsed the mug, and returned to Thomas's study with quiet purpose. She powered on the old desktop computer that Daniel had not bothered to check since his father passed. Margaret knew the password. Thomas had once told her she should always know where everything was, even the things she hoped never to use. She opened the family trust account portal and reviewed the transaction history carefully. Every mortgage payment for the past 2 years had been issued automatically from the trust's operating account. The vehicle loan tied to Daniel's luxury sport utility vehicle had been funded the same way. There were no direct contributions from Daniel's personal checking account, despite what he might have believed. Margaret printed the statements one by one, the printer humming steadily in the quiet room. She placed each page into a growing folder labeled Simply Documentation. Later that afternoon, she drove herself to the local bank branch 5 miles away. The November air carried a sharp edge, and she kept both hands steady on the steering wheel. At the bank, she requested a meeting with the branch manager, a woman in her early 40s named Cynthia, who had known Thomas professionally for years. Margaret asked direct questions and listened carefully to the answers. She confirmed that, as trustee, she held full authority over all distributions. She requested updated copies of signature cards and beneficiary designations. Cynthia printed everything without hesitation. "Is there a concern?" Cynthia asked gently. Margaret smiled politely. "No concern, just clarity." On her way home, she stopped by the office of Thomas's attorney, Robert Keller, who had drafted the original trust documents. His receptionist recognized her immediately and scheduled an appointment for the following week. Margaret did not explain the situation in detail. She simply said she would need a formal review before the end of the year. That evening, Daniel and Olivia returned from dinner with friends. Olivia carried a folder under her arm, and Margaret noticed the logo of a real estate agency embossed in gold along the corner. Olivia placed it casually on the kitchen counter, as if it belonged there already. Margaret stepped into the room and glanced at it only briefly. "I have an appointment next Tuesday," she said calmly, hanging her coat in the closet. "With Mr. Keller. We need to go over some estate paperwork." Daniel paused mid-step. "Is that necessary?" he asked. Margaret met his eyes, her expression unreadable. "It always is." Olivia forced a small laugh. "Of course. It is good to keep things organized." Margaret nodded once and turned off the kitchen lights. Upstairs, in the quiet of her bedroom, she placed the folder of printed statements inside her dresser drawer and closed it with deliberate care. They believed the timeline belonged to them. They had not realized she had already begun rewriting it. Tuesday arrived with a pale winter sky and a thin sheet of frost clinging to the edges of the driveway. Margaret dressed carefully in a navy wool coat and low-heeled leather shoes, the kind she had worn to every important meeting beside Thomas for decades. She did not rush. She brewed a fresh pot of coffee, poured a single cup, and stood by the kitchen window watching the sun rise over the quiet suburban street. Olivia had already left for a morning fitness class, and Daniel had driven downtown before 7:30. The house felt momentarily honest in their absence. Margaret gathered the leather portfolio containing the trust documents, the printed bank statements, and her handwritten notes. She placed them in the passenger seat of her sedan and drove the 12 miles to Robert Keller's office with steady hands. The law firm occupied the second floor of a brick building near the courthouse square. Robert greeted her personally, his expression softening with recognition and respect. He had been Thomas's attorney for nearly 15 years. They sat across from each other in a conference room with a long walnut table and a view of bare maple trees outside the window. Margaret laid out the documents in precise order. She did not dramatize. She simply explained what had been said at the Thanksgiving table, the intention to list the property, the pressure to relocate, and the assumption that the house could be sold without her involvement. Robert listened without interruption. When she finished, he adjusted his glasses and reviewed the trust agreement once more. "You are the sole trustee and primary beneficiary," he said clearly. "No property can be sold, transferred, or encumbered without your written consent. Furthermore, any attempt to coerce you into surrendering your rights would trigger protective provisions Thomas specifically requested." Margaret nodded. "And the distributions?" she asked. Robert turned to the financial schedules attached to the trust. "Discretionary. At your authority. If you determine that a beneficiary is acting against the interests of the trust or against you, you may suspend payments immediately." The room remained quiet for several seconds. Margaret looked down at Thomas's signature at the bottom of the original document, dated 5 years earlier. She remembered the evening he had returned from this very office, setting his briefcase down in the hallway and telling her, almost casually, that everything was taken care of. She had trusted him then without asking details. Now she understood what he meant. Robert leaned forward slightly. "If you anticipate further action from them, I recommend we prepare a formal notice outlining your position. We can also attend any family meeting if necessary." Margaret considered this. "Christmas dinner," she said softly. "They are planning to finalize things before the new year." Robert nodded once. "Then we will be ready before that." When Margaret returned home, Olivia was seated at the dining table with a stack of glossy brochures spread out like playing cards. Photographs of modern kitchens and open floor plans filled the pages. Olivia looked up with a polite smile. "How was your appointment?" she asked. Margaret removed her gloves and placed them carefully on the sideboard. "Productive," she replied. She stepped closer to the table and glanced at the brochure on top. The asking price printed in bold numbers read $875,000. Olivia tapped the page lightly. "The market is strong. We would be foolish not to act." Margaret met her gaze without raising her voice. "You may want to reconsider the timeline." Olivia's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. "Oh, do not worry. We will handle everything." Margaret nodded slowly and turned away, her expression unchanged. Upstairs, she placed Robert's business card beside her bedside lamp and opened her notebook again. She added a new entry with the date and a single sentence. Consultation confirmed full authority. Outside, the afternoon light faded early, casting long shadows across the lawn. Inside, preparations for Christmas had already begun. Margaret could feel the shift in the air. The confrontation they believed would remove her was slowly transforming into something else entirely. December unfolded with a quiet precision that Margaret appreciated. The house gradually transformed under Olivia's direction. Garlands draped along the staircase, a 12-foot fir tree installed in the living room, and boxes of ornaments opened as if the season itself were a performance. Margaret observed without interference. She allowed Olivia to dictate color themes and table settings, to rearrange furniture for what she called a more modern flow. Each decision seemed to carry an unspoken assumption that the home was already theirs. Margaret moved through the rooms calmly, dusting picture frames and polishing silver, her expression neutral. She had already signed the necessary paperwork at the bank to review discretionary distributions. The following week she scheduled a quiet meeting with the trust's financial advisor, a man named Harold Bennett, who had worked with Thomas for years. They met at a small office 15 minutes from the house, where Harold confirmed in measured tones that all ongoing payments could be paused within 48 hours of her written instruction. Margaret did not hesitate. She authorized a temporary review of all outgoing funds, including the mortgage distribution and the vehicle financing. Harold asked whether the suspension was permanent. Margaret replied that it was precautionary. On the drive home, she felt no triumph, only steadiness. That evening, Daniel mentioned that the next mortgage draft seemed delayed. Olivia frowned and suggested it was likely a routine banking issue. Margaret listened from her seat near the fireplace, knitting needles resting in her lap. "Banks correct errors quickly," she said quietly. Olivia's eyes narrowed slightly, calculating. Over the next several days, Margaret continued gathering documentation. She printed copies of email exchanges she discovered on the shared home computer, messages discussing listing dates and projected sale profits. She photographed the brochures Olivia had left on the counter. She kept her notes in the leather portfolio now stored in the locked drawer of her bedside table. Each action was deliberate and unemotional. Daniel grew increasingly restless as the car loan statement reflected a missed payment. Olivia's confidence began to show small fractures. She placed multiple phone calls, her voice tense but controlled, insisting that something had been mishandled. Margaret did not correct her. Instead, she set the dining table for Christmas Eve with the same crystal and china she had used for decades. She prepared a menu that included a spiral glazed ham, roasted vegetables, and a pecan pie Thomas had loved. Invitations had already been extended to a few extended relatives, and Robert Keller confirmed he would attend briefly after dessert. Margaret wrapped his business card in a small white envelope and placed it inside her knitting basket as a quiet reminder. On the evening before Christmas Eve, Daniel approached her in the hallway. "Mom, have you noticed any banking irregularities?" he asked carefully. Margaret met his gaze without blinking. "Irregularities often indicate a need for review," she replied. He hesitated, searching her face for reassurance that did not come. Upstairs, Olivia paced in their bedroom, speaking in clipped tones about temporary holds and processing delays. Margaret returned to her room and opened the drawer once more, reviewing the printed statements under the soft glow of her bedside lamp. Outside, snow began to fall lightly, covering the lawn in a thin white layer that reflected the streetlights. Inside, the house waited, decorated and silent. Christmas dinner would bring everyone to the same table again. This time, Margaret would not simply listen. Christmas Eve arrived with a quiet layer of snow blanketing the neighborhood, softening the sharp edges of rooftops and driveways. Margaret woke before sunrise and moved through the house with measured calm, turning on the tree lights and adjusting the red velvet ribbon that circled the staircase banister. The scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air. In the kitchen, she prepared the glaze for the ham, stirring brown sugar and mustard in a small saucepan while the oven preheated to 325 degrees. Every movement was deliberate, every detail familiar. Down the hallway, Daniel and Olivia spoke in hushed tones. The car dealership had called again about the delayed payment. The mortgage lender had sent a formal notice stating that no funds had been received for the month. Olivia insisted there had to be a processing error. Daniel sounded less certain. Margaret carried a tray of polished silverware to the dining table and arranged each fork and knife with exact spacing, aligning the crystal glasses so they reflected the soft glow of the chandelier. She heard Daniel approach before he spoke. "Mom, we need to talk about the accounts," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Margaret did not look up immediately. She adjusted a napkin, then met his eyes. "I agree," she replied. Olivia joined them moments later, her expression composed but strained. "There has been some confusion with the trust distributions," she said carefully. "We were told everything was automatic." Margaret folded her hands in front of her. "Automatic does not mean permanent," she said. The words were simple, almost gentle, but they settled heavily in the room. Olivia's posture stiffened. "What does that mean?" she asked. Margaret walked to the sideboard and retrieved a slim, white envelope. She placed it on the table between them. "It means we will clarify everything tonight," she said. Daniel glanced at the envelope but did not open it. "Clarify how?" he asked. Margaret's gaze shifted briefly toward the front window where snow continued to fall in slow, steady flakes. "With facts," she replied. The afternoon passed with an unusual quiet. Relatives began to arrive shortly after 5 o'clock, shaking snow from their coats and admiring the decorated tree. Laughter filled the living room, and for a moment the tension seemed hidden beneath holiday cheer. Olivia moved through the guests with practiced warmth, offering cider and complimenting scarves. Daniel hovered near the fireplace, distracted. Margaret greeted each visitor calmly, her navy dress pressed and her silver hair neatly pinned. When Robert Keller stepped through the doorway at 6:30, carrying a small gift bag and wearing a dark overcoat dusted with snow, Olivia's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "I thought this was just family," she said lightly. Margaret met her gaze without hesitation. "He is," she replied. Dinner was served at 7. The ham was carved. The vegetables passed, and polite conversation carried the table through the first course. Margaret waited until plates were cleared and dessert was set before she rose slowly from her chair. She did not raise her voice. She simply rested her fingertips on the back of her seat and looked at her son and daughter-in-law across the candlelit table. "Before we begin dessert," she said evenly, "there are matters we need to address." The room grew still. Snow pressed softly against the windows. Margaret nodded once toward Robert, who reached into his briefcase and placed a stack of documents neatly on the table. This time, she would not allow assumptions to speak for her. The dining room remained silent as Robert Keller opened his briefcase and withdrew a neatly organized stack of documents secured with a black binder clip. Candlelight flickered against the crystal glasses, reflecting small shards of light across the polished surface of the oak table. Margaret remained standing, her posture straight but unforced, her hands resting lightly on the back of her chair. She did not rush to speak. She allowed the quiet to settle over the room until even the distant hum of the refrigerator seemed loud. Robert cleared his throat gently. Before dessert, he began in a calm professional tone. "Mrs. Whitmore has requested that I clarify several legal matters regarding the ownership and financial structure of this property." Olivia shifted in her seat, the faint scrape of her chair against hardwood echoing more than it should have. "Is this really necessary tonight?" she asked, attempting a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. Margaret looked at her steadily. "It is," she replied. Daniel's expression tightened as Robert placed the first document in the center of the table and rotated it so everyone could see. "The residence located at this address," Robert continued, reading carefully, "is solely owned by Margaret Whitmore. The deed lists her as exclusive title holder. Any attempt to list or sell the property requires her signed authorization and trustee approval." A relative seated near the end of the table glanced between Daniel and Olivia, confusion rising quietly in the room. Olivia leaned forward. "We were told that after Thomas passed, everything transferred automatically," she said, her voice controlled but sharper now. Robert nodded. "It did transfer. To Mrs. Whitmore." The words landed with deliberate weight. Daniel's face lost color. As he reached for the document and scanned the printed text, Margaret observed him without expression. She saw the subtle tremor in his hand, the realization forming behind his eyes. Robert continued, placing a second stack of papers beside the first. "Additionally, The mortgage payments and vehicle financing for Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore have been funded through discretionary distributions from the Whitmore Family Trust. Those distributions are subject to trustee authority. Olivia's composure cracked slightly. What does that mean? She demanded. Margaret answered before Robert could speak. It means I approve those payments, she said quietly. And I can pause them. The room felt smaller, as if the walls had drawn closer. Snow pressed softly against the windows, muting the outside world. Daniel looked up at his mother for the first time that evening without defensiveness. You stopped them? He asked, almost whispering. Margaret did not blink. I initiated a review, she replied. Robert placed the final document on the table, a formal notice prepared earlier that week. There is also documentation, he added evenly, indicating discussions with a real estate agency regarding the listing of this property without the knowledge or consent of Mrs. Whitmore. Olivia's breath caught. We were planning, she said quickly. Nothing was finalized. Margaret's voice remained steady. You asked me to leave my own home, she said, not loudly, not angrily, simply stating fact. You discussed selling it before speaking to me honestly. The truth hung in the air, undeniable and clear. Daniel lowered his eyes to the table, the weight of his silence now visible. Margaret stepped back slightly, allowing the candlelight to illuminate her face. I will not be moving, she said. This house remains mine. The trust remains under my authority. If you choose to stay here, it will be with respect and transparency. No one interrupted her. The authority in her tone required no volume. Olivia sat rigid, calculating and cornered, the confidence she carried for weeks dissolving under the plain language of contracts and signatures. Daniel swallowed and nodded slowly, understanding dawning too late to avoid consequence. Margaret finally resumed her seat, smoothing her napkin across her lap. Now, she said softly, we may have dessert. The tension did not vanish, but it shifted. For the first time since Thanksgiving, Margaret did not feel displaced in her own home. She felt rooted, steady, and unmistakably in control. Dessert was served. In careful silence, Margaret cut the pecan pie into even slices, the knife gliding cleanly through the glossy filling while the room adjusted to a new balance of power. No one reached for their fork immediately. Robert Keller remained composed at the end of the table, his briefcase closed now, his role complete, but his presence unmistakable. Daniel stared at the documents still resting beside his plate, reading certain lines again as though repetition might change their meaning. Olivia sat upright, hands folded tightly in her lap, her expression controlled but pale under the warm glow of the chandelier. The earlier certainty that had colored her voice for weeks was gone. Margaret placed a slice of pie in front of Daniel first, then Olivia, then the relatives who avoided direct eye contact. She resumed her seat without ceremony. The review of distributions will continue until further notice, she said evenly, as though discussing holiday travel plans. During that time, no trust funds will be used for personal liabilities not approved by me. The statement was precise and free of emotion. Daniel inhaled slowly. Mom, we did not realize, he began, but the sentence did not find its ending. Margaret looked at him steadily. You did not ask, she replied. There was no accusation in her tone, only fact. Olivia straightened slightly. We assumed everything was structured for the family, she said carefully. Margaret nodded once. It is, she answered. And I am part of that family. The words were simple, but they reshaped the room. Outside, the snowfall had slowed, leaving the yard covered in a smooth, unbroken layer of white. Inside, the warmth of the house felt different now, not fragile, not borrowed. Robert cleared his throat gently. If there are future discussions about property or financial planning, they must include Mrs. Whitmore from the beginning, he said. That is not optional. Daniel lowered his eyes again. Olivia's shoulders dropped slightly, the tension visible in the small movements of her hands. Margaret took a measured bite of pie and set her fork down with quiet precision. You are welcome to remain here, she said calmly. But respect is not negotiable. Transparency is not negotiable. No one argued. The weight of signed documents and printed clauses carried more authority than raised voices ever could. The relatives resumed small talk cautiously, the conversation lighter, but changed. The illusion of control had dissolved, replaced by something firmer and unmistakable. When the evening drew to a close and coats were retrieved from the hallway closet, Daniel approached his mother once more. His voice was subdued. "I am sorry," he said simply. Margaret studied his face, the familiar lines softened by regret. "I expect better," she replied. It was neither rejection nor forgiveness. It was a boundary. Olivia lingered near the doorway, silent, calculating, but contained. The car keys that once symbolized independence now represented obligation. As the front door closed behind the last guest, and the house settled into stillness, Margaret turned off the chandelier and stood alone for a moment in the soft glow of the Christmas tree lights. She did not smile widely. She did not celebrate. She simply exhaled, knowing that the foundation beneath her feet had not shifted at all. It had always been hers. The days following Christmas were quieter than any Margaret could remember. The house no longer felt like a place under negotiation. It felt settled. Snow remained along the edges of the driveway in uneven patches, slowly melting beneath pale winter sunlight. Inside, decorations stayed up a little longer than usual, but the atmosphere had shifted. Daniel moved through the rooms with a new awareness, his steps measured, his voice softer. Olivia spoke less, her confidence replaced with caution. Margaret resumed her morning routine as she always had, rising before 7, preparing oatmeal on the stovetop, and reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. Nothing dramatic had changed, yet everything had. 2 days after Christmas, Daniel approached her with a folder in his hands. He set it down carefully beside her coffee cup. "We would like to review our expenses," he said quietly, without relying on the trust. Margaret looked at the folder, but did not open it. "That would be wise," she replied. She had already sent written confirmation to Harold Bennett that discretionary payments would remain paused indefinitely. The car loan would need to be refinanced under Daniel's own credit. The mortgage, if they wished to contribute, would require a formal rental agreement drafted through Robert Keller's office. These were not punishments. They were boundaries. Olivia began researching employment opportunities that week, updating her resume at the dining table where she had once spread out real estate brochures. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Conversations were now held openly, not in hushed tones. Behind closed doors, Margaret listened more than she spoke. When Daniel asked whether she would ever consider selling the property, she answered with the same calm clarity she had shown all month. "Perhaps one day," she said. "But it will be my decision, and it will be on my terms." He nodded, understanding that the discussion was no longer hypothetical leverage, but genuine dialogue. On New Year's Eve, Margaret stood alone in Thomas's study for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the back of his leather chair. The documents were neatly filed, the trust secure, the authority unquestioned. She had not needed to shout. She had not needed to threaten. She had simply read what was already written and refused to surrender what was legally and morally hers. Downstairs, the television counted down the final seconds of the year. Daniel and Olivia waited in the living room, uncertain but present. Margaret joined them as midnight approached. Fireworks flickered faintly in the distance beyond the frosted windows. When the clock struck 12, she did not make a grand toast. She simply said, "Let this year be different." The statement was quiet, but it carried weight. The house stood exactly where it had always stood, solid and unmoved. Margaret had not been pushed out. She had not been erased. She remained in her home, in her chair, in her name. And that was enough.